In the 1970s and 80s, our grandmothers knew how to make dinners in under 10 minutes that mattered. Their work in the kitchen didn't just fill a plate. They made cheap meals that kept them fed when no one was coming. These 30 forgotten 10-minute dinners from the 1970s might sound too plain today, but they kept seniors alive. Let's rediscover the 30 cheap vintage dinners seniors lived on when they cooked alone. Scrambled eggs on toast. People still make this today, not because it is cheap. It feels like home. Scrambled eggs on toast wasn't just breakfast. It was dinner when you lived alone and needed protein fast. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Crack 2 eggs into a bowl, scramble with a fork, melt butter in a small pan, cook the eggs soft, serve over buttered toast. The smell was butter and warm bread. The taste was simple: eggs, salt, butter, toast. It cost about 30 cents in 1965. One person, one meal. This worked because eggs were always in the refrigerator, bread was always in the bread box, and butter was always on the counter. No planning required, no leftovers to manage, just heat, eat, and one pan to wash. The meal stayed popular through the 1980s when microwave dinners started replacing simple cooking. But for seniors who grew up during the Depression, scrambled eggs on toast remained reliable. It was warm, filling, and predictable. But if scrambled eggs felt too heavy, what came next was even lighter and required nothing but a can opener. Tomato soup from a can was the definition of fast comfort. Seniors in the 1970s opened a can of Campbell's, added 1 can of water, heated it on the stove for 5 minutes, and served it with 2 slices of buttered white bread on the side. The smell was tomato and butter. The taste was tangy, sweet, creamy. It cost about 45 cents in 1970. 1 can, 1 meal. This worked because canned soup lasted months in the pantry. You could buy 6 cans on sale and always have dinner ready. No chopping, no measuring, no thinking, just open, heat, eat. The ritual mattered too. Warming soup felt like care when no one else was cooking for you. Dipping bread into the bowl made the meal last longer. Some seniors added a pinch of sugar to cut the acidity. Others stirred in a spoonful of cream to make it richer. Small adjustments turned a simple soup into something personal. Grilled cheese elevated tomato soup into a complete meal. Seniors in 1965 made this combination in 10 minutes. Butter, 2 slices of white bread, place 1 slice of American cheese between them, fry in a hot pan until golden on both sides, heat the soup while the sandwich cooks. The smell was butter, toasted bread, and melted cheese. The taste was salty, creamy, tangy when you dipped the sandwich into the soup. It cost about 60 cents in 1965. Bread, cheese, soup. This worked because the sandwich added substance. Soup alone left you hungry an hour later. Grilled cheese made it filling. The crispy bread, the melted cheese, the warm soup, it felt like a real dinner, not just survival food. This meal stayed common through the 1980s because it required minimal skill and created minimal cleanup. 1 pan for the sandwich, 1 pot for the soup. Seniors who couldn't stand for long cooking sessions could sit between flipping the sandwich. Grilled cheese satisfied with butter and heat, but what came next didn't even need a stove. Before we move on, many of you asked in the comments where to find these recipes. We even received tons of email too, so we published these recipes on our website. The link is in the description. Let's continue. Tuna salad on crackers wasn't a snack. It was dinner when you didn't want to cook. Seniors in the 1970s opened a can of tuna, drained the water, mixed it with 2 tablespoons of mayonnaise and a pinch of salt, spread it on saltine crackers, and ate it standing at the counter. The smell was fish and mayo. The taste was salty, creamy, crunchy. It cost about 50 cents in 1970. 1 can of tuna, crackers from the pantry. This worked because tuna didn't require cooking or heating. You could make it without turning on the stove. On hot summer evenings when kitchens felt like ovens, cold tuna on crackers was relief. A boiled hot dog with canned beans was a complete protein meal in under 10 minutes. Seniors in 1968 boiled one hot dog in a small pot, opened a can of Van Camp's baked beans, heated the beans in a saucepan, served both on one plate. The smell was smoky beans and boiled meat. The taste was sweet, smoky, salty. It cost about 55 cents in 1968. One hot dog, one small can of beans. This worked because both items were shelf-stable and required minimal preparation. Hot dogs lasted weeks in the refrigerator. Canned beans lasted years in the pantry. You could always make this meal without grocery shopping. No planning, no fresh ingredients, no spoilage risk. The combination stayed popular through the 1980s because it felt like a balanced meal. Protein from the hot dog, fiber from the beans, sweetness and salt in one plate. Some seniors cut the hot dog into the beans and ate it like a stew. Hot dogs and beans filled you fast, but what came after didn't need cooking at all, just a spoon and a bowl. These first 5 dinners weren't fancy. They were functional. Eggs, soup, grilled cheese, tuna, hot dogs, meals that required one pan, 10 minutes, and minimal cleanup. For seniors living alone, that simplicity wasn't laziness. It was survival strategy when cooking for one meant rationing energy as carefully as you rationed food. Cottage cheese with canned peaches wasn't dessert. It was dinner when you needed protein without cooking. Seniors in the 1972 scooped half a cup of cottage cheese into a bowl, opened a can of peaches, drained the syrup, placed 3 peach halves on top of the cheese, and ate it cold. The smell was sweet fruit and tangy dairy. The taste was creamy sweet cold. It cost about 60 cents in 1972. Small container of cottage cheese, 1 can of peaches. This worked because it required 0 cooking and 0 cleanup beyond a bowl and spoon. On days when standing felt difficult, when arthritis made hands stiff, when the stove felt like too much effort, cottage cheese and peaches was dinner. Cold, fast, and nourishing enough to quiet hunger until morning. The meal stayed common through the 1980s in nursing homes and senior centers because it met dietary needs: protein, calcium, fruit. But in home kitchens, it faded when microwaves made hot meals just as easy. Cottage cheese and peaches felt like dessert for dinner, but the next meal brought back salt and the smell of frying meat. Fried Spam with bread was protein, salt, and fat in under 10 minutes. Seniors in the 1970s sliced Spam into quarter-inch rounds, fried them in a hot pan until edges crisped, served 2 slices on white bread with mustard. The smell was salty pork and caramelized meat. The taste was greasy, salty, smoky. It cost about 65 cents in 1970. 1 can of Spam lasted several meals. This worked because Spam didn't require refrigeration until opened, and once opened, it lasted a week. 1 can meant 3 or 4 dinners. No grocery trips, no meal planning, just slice, fry, eat. The meal faded in the 1990s when Spam became associated with poverty and poor nutrition. Instant mashed potatoes with canned gravy was comfort food in under 10 minutes. Seniors in the 1975 boiled water, stirred in instant potato flakes, added butter and milk, heated canned gravy in a small pot, poured gravy over the potatoes. The smell was butter and brown gravy. The taste was starchy, salty, creamy. It cost about 70 cents in 1975. Box of instant potatoes, can of gravy. This worked because both items were pantry staples that never spoiled. You could make this meal at midnight if hunger woke you. No fresh ingredients, no prep work, no knife skills. Just boil, stir, heat. The meal stayed popular through the 1990s because it felt like Thanksgiving dinner without the effort. Mashed potatoes and gravy triggered memories of family meals, holidays, abundance. The sandwich stayed common through the 1980s because it was portable and stable. You could wrap it, save half for later, eat it cold without losing quality. For seniors with limited mobility, meals that didn't require immediate consumption mattered. Peanut butter and banana tasted like memory, but what came next smelled like breakfast, even when eaten alone at night. Canned corned beef hash was a complete meal from one can. Seniors in the 1968 opened the can, dumped the contents into a hot pan, fried it until the bottom crisped, flipped sections to brown the other side, served it on a plate with ketchup. The smell was fried potatoes and salty meat. The taste was crispy, salty, starchy. It cost about 75 cents in 1968. One can, one meal. This worked because hash was dense. One can filled you up. It had potatoes, meat, fat, salt, everything the body needed in one serving, and it cooked fast. 7 minutes in a hot pan turned cold mush into crispy comfort food. The meal faded in the 1990s when fresh foods became the standard and canned hash was rebranded as unhealthy. But for seniors who lived through the Depression and World War II, canned hash was reliability. It was food you could count on when nothing else was certain. These first 10 meals show a pattern: speed, economy, minimal cleanup, eggs, soup, sandwiches, canned meat, all ready in 10 minutes or less. For seniors living alone in the 1960s and 70s, cooking wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about eating something warm before the day ended and the kitchen light went out. Sardines on toast wasn't a fancy meal. It was protein you could afford when the grocery budget ran tight and cooking felt like too much work. Seniors living alone in the 1970s and 1980s kept tins of sardines in the cupboard because they didn't spoil, didn't need refrigeration, and cost less than $1. You opened the tin with the key that came wrapped around it, drained the oil into the sink, and laid the tiny silver fish flat on toasted white bread. Some added a stripe of yellow mustard to cut the fishiness. Others ate them plain with just salt. The smell filled the kitchen, briny, oily, sharp, and lingered for hours. The taste was intensely salty and ocean-heavy, with soft bones you could chew through if you wanted the calcium. The texture was slippery and dense, almost meaty. It wasn't elegant, but it was fast, filling, and required no cleanup beyond rinsing the fork. Sardines on toast disappeared when younger generations rejected canned fish as old people food, and grocery stores started stocking fresher, less pungent options. Seniors stopped buying them when eating alone made the smell feel too strong, too obvious. Too much like admitting no one else was coming to dinner. The tin sat unopened in the back of the cupboard until it rusted. But if sardines felt too bold, what came next was so mild it barely tasted like anything, and that was the point. Egg drop soup made from a bouillon cube wasn't authentic Chinese food. It was an improvisation born from needing something warm, light, and easy when your stomach couldn't handle anything heavier. Seniors in the 1980s and 1990s kept jars of chicken bouillon cubes in the pantry because one cube dissolved in boiling water made broth in under 2 minutes. You cracked an egg into a mug, beat it with a fork, then poured it slowly into the simmering broth while stirring. The egg cooked instantly into thin, soft ribbons that floated like clouds. Some added a dash of soy sauce or a sprinkle of dried parsley to make it feel more like a real meal. Others ate it plain, sipping it from a mug while sitting at the kitchen table with the radio on. The soup was pale yellow, translucent, and smelled faintly of salt and chicken. The taste was mild, almost bland, but that was the comfort. It didn't challenge your appetite or your digestion. It was warm liquid that felt like care without requiring effort. Egg drop soup from Bouillon faded when instant ramen became cheaper and seniors stopped trusting their hands to crack eggs without making a mess. The ritual of stirring, waiting, sipping slowly, all of it disappeared when microwaves made convenience faster than comfort. The taste was mild, almost bland, but that was the comfort. It didn't challenge your appetite or your digestion. It was warm liquid that felt like care without requiring effort. Egg drop soup from Bouillon faded when instant ramen became cheaper and seniors stopped trusting their hands to crack eggs without making a mess. The ritual of stirring, waiting, sipping slowly, all of it disappeared when microwaves made convenience faster than comfort. But if egg drop soup felt too thin, what came next was thick, buttery, and tasted like childhood before the bills started piling up. Buttered noodles weren't a side dish. They were the whole meal when nothing else in the cupboard made sense, and you needed to eat something before the shaking started. Seniors living alone in the 1970s through the 1990s kept boxes of elbow macaroni or egg noodles in the pantry because they boiled in under 10 minutes and didn't require a recipe. You drained the noodles, dumped them back into the pot, added a tablespoon of butter, and watched it melt into a glossy coating. A shake of green can Parmesan cheese added salt and a faint sharpness that made it taste like more than just starch and fat. The noodles were soft, slippery, warm. The butter pooled at the bottom of the bowl, turning each bite rich and heavy. The Parmesan added texture, gritty, dusty, slightly metallic, but it made the dish feel finished. Some ate it straight from the pot to avoid washing a bowl. Others portioned it onto a plate and ate slowly, making it last. Buttered noodles with Parmesan disappeared when aging hands couldn't grip pot handles safely and boiling water became a burn risk. Seniors stopped making them when eating alone turned comfort food into evidence of how small their world had become. The box of noodles sat unopened in the cupboard, the butter went rancid in the fridge, and the Parmesan can grew dusty on the shelf. But if buttered noodles felt too rich, what came next was salty, portable, and fit on a single cracker. Vienna sausages with saltines wasn't dinner. It was what you ate when opening a can felt easier than turning on the stove, and you'd already skipped lunch. Seniors living alone in the 1980s and 1990s kept tins of Vienna sausages in the cupboard because they were cheap, shelf-stable, and didn't require cooking. You peeled back the pull-tab lid, drained the cloudy gel, and ate the tiny sausages straight from the can with a fork. Some placed them on saltine crackers to make it feel more like a meal. Others ate them cold, standing at the counter, before putting the lid back on and saving the rest for tomorrow. The sausages were soft, slippery, and tasted like salt, pork fat, and something faintly chemical. The texture was uniform, no bite, no resistance, just smooth processed meat that dissolved on your tongue. The saltines added crunch and soaked up the gelatin that clung to each piece. It wasn't good, but it was fast, filling, and required no cleanup beyond rinsing the fork. Vienna sausages disappeared when sodium warnings scared seniors away from canned meats, and younger family members started commenting on what was in the cupboard. Eating them alone in a quiet kitchen made the meal feel too small, too desperate, too much like giving up. The tin stayed unopened until it dented and rusted, but if Vienna sausages felt too salty, what came next was warm, sweet, and tasted like mornings before the world got complicated. Cream of wheat with brown sugar wasn't breakfast. It was comfort you could eat with a spoon when chewing felt like work, and your stomach needed something gentle. Seniors living alone in the 1970s and 1980s kept boxes of cream of wheat in the pantry because it cooked in under 5 minutes and didn't require teeth, appetite, or energy. You boiled water, stirred in the powder, watched it thicken into a smooth, pale porridge, then spooned brown sugar on top until it melted into sweet, grainy pools. Cream of wheat disappeared when instant oatmeal packets became easier and seniors stopped wanting to stand at the stove stirring. Eating it alone made the meal feel too much like baby food, too much like regression, too much like admitting you couldn't handle real meals anymore. But if cream of wheat felt too soft, what came next had bite and tasted like picnics before the loneliness set in. These first 15 meals weren't just quick, they were quiet. They didn't ask for company, didn't require conversation, didn't leave leftovers that reminded you no one else was coming. But the next 5 meals pushed even further into simplicity, where opening a can became the entire cooking process. Deviled ham spread on white bread wasn't a sandwich. It was paste on soft bread when the budget ran out and you needed protein that didn't require refrigeration or cooking. Seniors living alone in the 1980s and 1990s kept the small flat tins of Underwood deviled ham in the cupboard because they cost under $1 and lasted for months. You peeled back the pull tab, scraped the pink-gray spread onto white bread with a butter knife, folded it in half, and ate it in 3 bites. Some added a thin slice of American cheese or a smear of mayonnaise to soften the intense saltiness. Others ate it plain, chewing quickly to get it over with. The spread was dense, fatty, salty, tasting like ham, spices, and something faintly metallic. The texture was smooth but slightly grainy, clinging to the roof of your mouth. The white bread helped, absorbing the grease and making each bite less overwhelming. It wasn't pleasant, but it was filling, fast, and required no cleanup beyond wiping the knife. Deviled ham disappeared when sodium warnings made canned meats seem dangerous, and younger generations called it mystery meat. Seniors stopped buying it when eating it alone made the kitchen smell too strong, the taste too sharp, the meal too much like evidence of how far their standards had fallen. The tin stayed unopened in the cupboard until the label faded. But if deviled ham felt too heavy, what came next was light, familiar, and tasted like every sick day you ever had as a child. Canned chicken noodle soup with oyster crackers wasn't dinner. It was what you heated when your body needed warmth, but your appetite had disappeared and cooking felt impossible. Seniors living alone in the 1970s through the 1990s kept cans of Campbell's chicken noodle soup in the pantry because it was cheap, familiar, and required only a pot and a can opener. You opened the can, dumped the condensed soup into a saucepan, added 1 can of water, stirred, and heated it until steam rose. You poured it into a bowl, dropped a handful of oyster crackers on top, and watched them soften and sink. The soup was pale yellow, thin, and smelled like salt and celery. The taste was mild, almost medicinal, with soft noodles, tiny carrot cubes, and shreds of chicken so tender they dissolved. The oyster crackers added texture, turning soggy and thick as they soaked up the broth. It was warm, easy to swallow, and didn't challenge your stomach or your energy. Canned chicken noodle soup faded when microwaves made reheating individual servings faster and seniors stopped wanting to wash pots. Eating it alone turned comfort into routine, then routine into evidence of how small and predictable life had become. The can sat in the cupboard until the label tore and the contents bulged. But if chicken noodle soup felt too watery, what came next was richer, softer, and required timing you learned as a child. A soft-boiled egg with toast soldiers wasn't breakfast. It was ritual, precision, and comfort, compressed into 5 minutes when nothing else felt manageable. Seniors living alone in the 1970s and 1980s kept eggs in the fridge because they were cheap, versatile, and didn't spoil quickly. You filled a small pot with water, brought it to a rolling boil, lowered 1 egg in with a spoon, set a timer for exactly 4 minutes, then pulled it out and placed it in an egg cup. You sliced the top off with a knife, revealing the bright yellow yolk still liquid inside. You toasted 2 slices of white bread, buttered them, cut them into thin strips, soldiers, and dipped them into the runny yolk. The egg white was firm but tender, the yolk warm and creamy, tasting rich and faintly sulfuric. The toast was crisp, buttery, and soaked up the yolk in one perfect bite. The process required attention. Boiling too long made the yolk hard, too short left the white slimy. But getting it right felt like control when everything else was slipping. Soft-boiled eggs with toast soldiers disappeared when aging hands couldn't peel hot shells safely, and timing became unreliable. Eating it alone made the ritual feel performative, too precise, too much like cooking for an audience that would never come. The egg cup gathered dust in the cupboard, unused. But if soft-boiled eggs felt too delicate, what came next was thick, spicy, and came straight from a can with no apology. Canned chili over saltines wasn't dinner. It was heat, salt, and beans when you needed something that stuck to your ribs and didn't require a stove. Seniors living alone in the 1980s and 1990s kept cans of Hormel or Wolf brand chili in the cupboard because it was cheap, filling, and could be eaten cold if the power went out. You opened the can, dumped the thick, dark red contents into a bowl, microwaved it for 2 minutes, then crumbled saltine crackers on top to soak up the grease. Some added shredded cheese or a dollop of sour cream to cool the heat. Others ate it plain, chewing through beans, ground meat, and tomato paste. The chili was thick, salty, faintly spicy, and tasted like cumin, chili powder, and something metallic from the can. The texture was dense, beans soft, meat crumbly, sauce clinging to everything. The saltines added crunch and absorbed the liquid, turning each bite into a thick, salty mash. It was heavy, filling, and didn't taste good, but it was warm and required almost no effort. Canned chili disappeared when sodium and fat content made it seem dangerous, and seniors stopped wanting meals that sat heavy in their stomachs. Eating it alone made the kitchen smell too strong, the portion too large. The leftovers too much like evidence no one else was coming. The can stayed unopened until it dented, but if chili felt too heavy, what came next was light, fresh, and tasted like summer before the kitchen went quiet. A tomato sandwich with mayo and salt wasn't a meal. It was summer on white bread when tomatoes were cheap, ripe, and you didn't have the energy to cook anything more complicated. Seniors living alone in the 1970s and 1980s kept tomatoes on the counter because they didn't need refrigeration, and a single tomato could stretch across 2 meals. You sliced the tomato thick, laid the slices on soft white bread, slathered with mayonnaise, sprinkled salt and black pepper on top, then pressed the second slice of bread down gently so the juice soaked in without squishing out. The tomato was cool, juicy, and tasted sweet tart and faintly acidic. The mayonnaise added richness, turning each bite creamy and smooth. The salt brought out the tomato's flavor and made the whole thing taste brighter, fresher, almost alive. The bread softened as the juice soaked through, turning the sandwich into something you had to eat over the sink or risk dripping. Tomato sandwiches disappeared when buying fresh tomatoes year-round became normal, and seniors stopped wanting meals that required eating quickly before they fell apart. Eating it alone made the mess feel too obvious, the simplicity too childish, the silence too loud. The tomato sat on the counter until it wrinkled and rotted, uneaten. But these first 20 meals were just the surface. What came next went deeper, into the foods seniors made when no one was watching, and shame didn't matter anymore. The first 20 meals were recognizable, things you might have seen on a table or remembered from childhood. But the next 10 pushed into stranger territory, where convenience met desperation, and seniors made meals that didn't look like food anymore. just fuel, fast, cheap, and silent. Milk toast with butter and sugar wasn't breakfast. It was what you ate when your stomach couldn't handle solid food, your teeth ached, and chewing felt like punishment. Seniors living alone in the 1950s through the 1980s made milk toast when illness, digestion issues, or simple exhaustion made cooking impossible. The recipe was basic. Toast a slice of white bread until it was golden and firm, butter it while it was still hot, so the butter melted into every pore, tear it into pieces, place the pieces in a shallow bowl, then pour warm milk over the top until the bread floated and softened. Some sprinkled white or brown sugar on top to add sweetness. Others added a pinch of cinnamon or nutmeg to make it feel less like invalid food. The result was soft, warm, and tasted like butter, milk, and sugar, bland, gentle, and easy to swallow. The texture was soggy, almost mushy, with the crisp edges of the toast dissolving into the milk within seconds. It wasn't meant to be delicious. It was meant to be digestible, soothing, and warm enough to settle a nervous stomach or calm nausea. You ate it slowly, with a spoon, sitting at the kitchen table in the morning light or late at night when sleep wouldn't come. Milk toast was common in the early to mid-20th century, especially among the elderly, the sick, and new mothers recovering from childbirth. It was considered gentle, nourishing, and appropriate for anyone whose body couldn't handle heavier meals. Doctors recommended it. Grandmothers made it. It was passed down not as a recipe but as care, something you made for someone who needed softness. But milk toast disappeared in the 1980s and 1990s when instant oatmeal packets, meal replacement shakes, and microwavable soups became easier and faster. Seniors stopped making it because eating it alone felt too much like being sick, too much like needing care that wasn't coming, too much like admitting weakness. The act of tearing toast, pouring milk, and eating with a spoon became a ritual that highlighted absence. No one was there to make it for you. No one was there to check if you were okay. The meal that once represented comfort became a reminder of isolation, and so it faded quietly, replaced by foods that didn't require tenderness or time. But if milk toast felt too soft, what came next had richness, sharpness, and melted into something that almost felt indulgent. Melted cheese on toast under the broiler wasn't grilled cheese. It was faster, simpler, and required no flipping, no butter, no pan. Seniors living alone in the 1970s and 1980s made it when they wanted something warm and filling, but didn't want to stand at the stove monitoring heat and timing. The process was quick. Place a slice of white bread on a sheet of aluminum foil or directly on the oven rack. Lay a slice of American cheese on top, slide it under the broiler, and watch through the oven door as the cheese bubbled, browned, and melted into the bread. You pulled it out when the edges started to char, let it cool for a few seconds, then ate it with your hands or folded it in half. The cheese was hot, gooey, and tasted salty and slightly tangy, with a faint burnt flavor from the broiler. The bread underneath stayed soft and soaked up the melted fat, while the top crisped and browned. The texture was a mix of chewy, crispy, and creamy all at once. It was simple, fast, and satisfying in a way that didn't require effort or thought. You could make it in under 5 minutes, eat it standing at the counter, and walk away without washing a single dish. Melted cheese on toast was popular because it was foolproof. You didn't need to butter the pan, worry about burning, or time the flip. The broiler did all the work. Seniors with arthritis, tremors, or weakened grip strength could make it without struggling. It was predictable, reliable, and comforting in its plainness. But melted cheese on toast disappeared when microwaves became standard, and seniors stopped turning on the oven for a single slice. The broiler felt dangerous, easy to forget, easy to burn, easy to leave on by accident. Eating it alone made the meal feel too quick, too small, too much like grabbing fuel instead of sitting down to eat. The ritual of watching the cheese bubble and melt through the oven door became a solitary act that highlighted the silence in the kitchen. No one else was waiting. No one else was hungry. The aluminum foil crumpled in the trash, and the oven stayed cold. But if melted cheese felt too rich, what came next was salty, creamy, and came straight from the military with no apology. Creamed dried beef on toast, nicknamed SOS or shit on a shingle by soldiers, wasn't elegant, but it was filling, fast, and made from ingredients that didn't spoil. Seniors living alone in the 1960s through the 1980s, especially those who had served in or lived through World War II, kept jars of dried beef in the cupboard because it was shelf-stable, salty, and could be turned into a meal in under 10 minutes. The process was simple. Tear the dried beef into strips, rinse it under cold water to remove some of the salt, then cook it in a saucepan with butter, flour, and milk to make a thick white sauce. You poured the creamy, beef-studded gravy over toasted white bread and ate it with a fork. The dried beef was intensely salty, chewy, and tasted like concentrated meat and preservatives. The white sauce, made from a quick roux of butter and flour, was thick, creamy, and bland, which helped balance the sharpness of the beef. The toast softened under the weight of the sauce, soaking it up and turning dense and heavy. The meal was warm, filling, and tasted like salt, fat, and nostalgia for a time when food didn't need to be fancy to matter. Creamed dried beef on toast was common in military kitchens, diners, and working-class homes throughout the mid-20th century. It was cheap, easy, and made use of ingredients that didn't require refrigeration. For seniors who had eaten it during the war or in the years after, it was a taste of survival, shared meals, and a time when everyone ate the same thing without complaint. But creamed dried beef disappeared when sodium warnings made dried beef seem dangerous, and younger generations rejected it as old people food that tasted too salty, too processed, too much like poverty. Grocery stores stopped stocking it, and the jars that remained in cupboards went unopened. Seniors stopped making it because eating it alone turned nostalgia into evidence of how much had changed. The meal that once fed hundreds in mess halls became a private, silent act of remembering, a taste that no one else wanted, a memory that couldn't be shared. The toast went cold, the sauce congealed, and the recipe disappeared. But if creamed dried beef felt too heavy, what came next was lighter, thinner, and barely qualified as soup at all. Potato soup from instant flakes wasn't real soup. It was powder, water, and butter turned into something warm and thick when you needed calories fast and didn't have the energy to peel, boil, or mash anything. Seniors living alone in the 1980s and 1990s kept boxes of instant mashed potato flakes in the cupboard because they were cheap, shelf-stable, and versatile. To make soup, you boiled water in a small pot, stirred in a few spoonfuls of potato flakes until the mixture thickened, added a pat of butter and a sprinkle of salt, then thinned it with milk or more water until it reached soup consistency. Some added a dash of black pepper or dried parsley to make it look more like real food. Others ate it plain, spooning it slowly while it was still too hot. The soup was pale, creamy, and tasted like butter, salt, and faint potato starch. The texture was smooth but slightly grainy, with a slick, almost gluey consistency that coated your mouth. It wasn't good, but it was warm, filling, and easy to swallow. It didn't require chopping, stirring, or waiting. It was done in under 5 minutes, eaten in under 10, and forgotten by the time you rinsed the bowl. Potato soup from instant flakes was never considered real cooking. It was survival, a way to get warm food into your body when appetite, energy, or money had run out. It was common among seniors living alone because it required minimal effort, no fresh ingredients, and no cleanup. You could make it in the same pot you boiled water in, Eat it with the same spoon you stirred with, and wash one bowl when you were done. But potato soup from instant flakes disappeared when meal replacement shakes and microwavable soups became more convenient, and seniors stopped wanting to stand at the stove stirring powder. Eating it alone made the meal feel too improvised, too desperate, too much like admitting you'd stopped caring what food tasted like. The ritual of boiling water, stirring, thinning, tasting, all of it became a solitary act that highlighted the silence. The box of instant flakes sat unopened in the back of the cupboard, hardening into clumps, until it was thrown away during a move or after a fall when someone else cleaned out the kitchen. A fried egg sandwich with ketchup wasn't breakfast. It was what you made when you were hungry, tired, and needed protein fast without thinking about it. Seniors living alone in the 1970s through the 1990s made fried egg sandwiches because eggs were cheap, bread was cheaper, and ketchup made everything taste better. The process was simple. Heat a small skillet, crack an egg into it, fry it until the edges crisped and the yolk set, or stayed runny depending on preference, slide it onto a slice of white bread, squirt ketchup on top, press the second slice down, and eat it with both hands before the yolk broke and ran down your wrist. The egg was hot, greasy, and tasted like butter or oil from the pan. The yolk, if left runny, added richness and turned the bread soft and golden. The ketchup added sweetness, acidity, and a bright red streak that made the sandwich look less plain. The bread soaked up the grease and yolk, turning dense and heavy. The texture was soft, slippery, and messy, requiring quick bites and a napkin nearby. Fried egg sandwiches with ketchup were common in diners, truck stops, and working-class kitchens throughout the 20th century. They were fast, filling, and required no recipe. For seniors living alone, they were muscle memory. Crack, fry, flip, slide, squirt, eat. You didn't think about it, you just did it. But fried egg sandwiches disappeared when microwaves made reheating frozen breakfast sandwiches faster, and seniors stopped wanting to clean skillets or risk burns from hot oil. The smell of frying eggs in an empty kitchen became too strong, too obvious, too much like evidence that you were cooking for one. The sandwich that once tasted like mornings before work, before kids, before everything got complicated, became a reminder of how small and quiet life had become. The skillet stayed in the drawer, the eggs went bad in the fridge, the ketchup bottle dried at the cap, unopened. But if a fried egg sandwich felt too greasy, what came next was spicy, dense, and came from a can you never saw anywhere else. The first 25 meals were quick, cheap, and required almost nothing. But the last 5 pushed even further, into foods that didn't resemble meals anymore, just fuel seniors ate when hunger outweighed taste and no one was there to judge what went on the plate. Canned tamales heated in a pan weren't Mexican food. They were thick, greasy, and tasted like corn, chili, and something metallic that clung to your tongue long after you swallowed. Seniors living alone in the 1970s and 1980s kept cans of Hormel tamales in the cupboard because they were cheap, filling, and didn't require cooking skill or fresh ingredients. You opened the can with a manual can opener, dumped the tamales, still wrapped in their corn husks or just loose in thick red sauce, into a small skillet, heated them over medium until the sauce bubbled and the tamales softened, then slid them onto a plate and ate them with a fork. The tamales were dense, heavy, and tasted like masa, pork, chili powder, and fat. The corn husks, if included, were papery and inedible, but some seniors didn't realize that and ate them anyway, chewing through the tough, fibrous texture. The red sauce was thick, greasy, and tasted more like tomato paste and cumin than actual chili. The texture was mushy, uniform, and didn't have the bite or structure of real tamales made by hand. It wasn't good, but it was warm, filling, and required almost no effort. Canned tamales were sold in grocery stores across America for decades, often stocked on the same shelf as canned chili, Spam, and Vienna sausages. They were marketed as authentic Mexican food, but most Mexican families wouldn't recognize them. They were a product of mid-century convenience culture, canned, processed, and designed to last on shelves for years. For seniors living alone, they were a fast, cheap dinner that didn't require planning or skill. You could eat them straight from the can if you had to, but canned tamales disappeared in the 1990s and 2000s when grocery stores started stocking frozen tamales, fresh tamales from local vendors, and younger generations rejected canned versions as inauthentic and unappetizing. Seniors stopped buying them when the metallic taste became harder to ignore and heating a skillet felt too risky. The act of eating tamales alone in a quiet kitchen, greasy, thick, and lukewarm, felt less like dinner and more like evidence of how far standards had fallen. The can sat in the cupboard until it dented and bulged, then got thrown away during a kitchen clean-out after a hospitalization or death. The tamales no one wanted to eat became the meal no one wanted to remember. But if canned tamales felt too heavy, what came next was lighter, crisper, and required nothing but a plate and your hand. Cheese and crackers with apple slices wasn't dinner. It was what you assembled when cooking felt impossible. Appetite had disappeared, and you needed something that counted as eating without turning on the stove. Seniors living alone in the 1980s and 1990s kept blocks of cheddar or packages of American cheese slices in the fridge, boxes of Ritz or saltine crackers in the cupboard, and apples on the counter because they didn't spoil quickly and required no preparation. You sliced the cheese into thin squares, placed each square on a cracker, cut the apple into wedges, arranged everything on a plate, and ate slowly, one piece at a time, while watching the evening news or staring out the window. The cheese was sharp or mild, depending on what you bought. The crackers were buttery or salty, and the apples were crisp, sweet, and slightly tart. Together, they didn't taste like a meal. They tasted like a snack stretched into dinner. The textures were simple: crunchy crackers, firm cheese, crisp apple. There was no warmth, no sauce, no complexity. It was cold, plain, and required no cleanup beyond wiping crumbs from the table. It was food as function, calories consumed, hunger dulled, day ended. Cheese and crackers with apple slices was never meant to replace a hot meal. It was what you ate when making a hot meal felt like too much work, when the kitchen felt too big, when sitting down to a full plate meant acknowledging how empty the table was. It was common among seniors who had stopped cooking for themselves, who had lost appetite after the death of a spouse, who ate alone and no longer saw the point in making food taste good. It was quiet, minimal, and forgettable. But cheese and crackers with apple slices disappeared when prepackaged snack trays, Lunchables, cheese and cracker kits, fruit and nut boxes became available, and seniors stopped wanting to assemble even the simplest meals. The act of slicing, arranging, and plating felt performative when no one was there to see it. The cheese dried out in the fridge, the crackers went stale in the box, and the apples wrinkled on the counter. Uneaten, the plate that once held a simple, intentional meal sat empty in the dish rack, a reminder that even the smallest acts of care had become too much to maintain alone. But if cheese and crackers felt too cold, what came next was warm, sweet, and tasted like mornings you didn't have to rush through anymore. Instant oatmeal with raisins and honey wasn't breakfast. It was what you ate when your stomach needed something soft, warm, and easy to swallow before the day started or after it ended. Seniors living alone in the 1980s and 1990s kept boxes of instant oatmeal packets in the cupboard because they were cheap, fast, and required no measuring or stirring. You tore open a packet, dumped the powdered oats into a bowl, added boiling water from the kettle, stirred for 30 seconds, then let it sit until it thickened. Some added a handful of raisins and a drizzle of honey to make it taste less plain. Others ate it straight from the packet, bland and unsweetened, because sweetness felt unnecessary. The oatmeal was thick, warm, and tasted like oats, sugar, and whatever artificial flavor, maple, apple cinnamon, brown sugar, came in the packet. The texture was soft, slightly gummy, and stuck to the spoon. The raisins softened in the heat, turning chewy and sweet. The honey added richness and a floral note that made each bite feel less like medicine. It wasn't delicious, but it was gentle, warm, and easy to digest. It didn't challenge your appetite or your stomach. It was predictable, safe, and done in under 5 minutes. Instant oatmeal became common in the 1960s when Quaker introduced individual packets that didn't require cooking on the stove. For seniors living alone, it was a lifeline. No pots to wash, no risk of burning, no standing at the stove. You could make it in a mug, eat it in bed, and fall back asleep if you needed to. It was simple, forgiving, and didn't require energy or focus. It was something you could do on autopilot when everything else felt too hard. But instant oatmeal with raisins and honey faded when meal replacement shakes and protein bars became easier, and seniors stopped wanting to boil water or wait for oats to thicken. The ritual of tearing the packet, pouring, stirring, waiting, all of it became a reminder of how small and repetitive life had become. The oatmeal that once tasted like care became evidence of routine without purpose, meals without appetite, mornings without plans. The box of packets sat unopened in the cupboard, the raisins hardened in the bag, and the honey crystallized in the jar, forgotten until someone else cleaned out the kitchen and threw it all away. But if oatmeal felt too plain, what came next was fishy, salty, and came on bread you didn't have to cook. An open-faced salmon sandwich wasn't lunch. It was canned fish on bread when you needed protein, omega-3s, and something that felt more substantial than crackers but didn't require cooking. Seniors living alone in the 1970s and 1980s kept cans of pink salmon in the cupboard because it was cheap, shelf-stable, and considered healthier than tuna or Spam. You opened the can with a manual can opener, drained the liquid into the sink, picked out the soft bones and skin, or left them in for calcium, then mashed the salmon with a fork directly in the can or in a small bowl. You spread it thick on a slice of white or wheat bread, sometimes adding a thin layer of mayonnaise, a squeeze of lemon juice, or a sprinkle of black pepper. You ate it with a knife and fork, or folded it in half and ate it with your hands, depending on how much effort you had left. The salmon was pale pink, soft, and tasted fishy, salty, and faintly metallic. The texture was flaky but dense, with soft bones that dissolved on your tongue if you didn't pick them out. The mayonnaise added richness and creaminess, masking some of the fishiness. The bread soaked up the oil from the salmon, turning slightly soggy and heavy. The lemon juice, if added, brightened the flavor and made it taste fresher, less canned. It wasn't elegant, but it was filling, high in protein, and required no cooking. Open-faced salmon sandwiches were common in mid-century American homes, especially among seniors and people recovering from illness. Doctors recommended canned salmon for its calcium, from the bones, and protein. It was seen as a healthy, affordable option for people who couldn't afford fresh fish or didn't have the energy to cook. For seniors living alone, it was a fast, easy meal that didn't spoil and didn't require refrigeration until after the can was open. But open-faced salmon sandwiches disappeared when younger generations rejected canned fish as old people food, and grocery stores started stocking fresh salmon fillets, smoked salmon, and salmon patties in the freezer aisle. Seniors stopped buying canned salmon when eating it alone made the kitchen smell too fishy, the meal too solitary, the act of mashing fish in a can too much like evidence of how low standards had fallen. The sandwich that once felt nutritious and practical became a marker of poverty, isolation, and decline. The can stayed unopened in the cupboard until it dented, and the salmon inside turned dark and metallic, inedible and forgotten. But if salmon felt too fishy, what came next was the simplest meal of all: beans on bread and nothing else. Baked beans with plain white bread wasn't dinner. It was fuel, fast, cheap, and eaten standing at the counter when sitting down felt like too much effort. Seniors living alone in the 1970s through the 1990s kept cans of Van Camp's or Bush's baked beans in the cupboard because they cost under $1, didn't spoil, and could be eaten cold or hot, depending on how much energy you had left. You opened the can, dumped the beans into a bowl, heated them in the microwave for 2 minutes, then tore pieces of plain white bread and used them to scoop the beans into your mouth. Some ate the beans cold, straight from the can, with a spoon. Others heated them on the stove, stirring slowly until the sauce thickened and bubbled. The beans were soft, sweet, and tasted like molasses, brown sugar, and pork fat. The sauce was thick, sticky, and clung to the bread, turning it soggy and heavy. The texture was uniform. No bite, no resistance, just soft beans in sweet sauce. The white bread added bulk and soaked up the liquid, making each bite dense and filling. It wasn't good, but it was warm, easy to swallow, and required no thought. You could eat it in under 5 minutes, rinse the bowl, and walk away. Baked beans with plain white bread was common in working-class and rural households throughout the 20th century. It was cheap, fast, and filled you up when money was tight and cooking felt impossible. For seniors living alone, it was muscle memory. Open, heat, eat. You didn't think about it. You just did it because hunger was real and food needed to be simple. But baked beans with plain white bread disappeared when microwavable single-serving meals became cheaper and seniors stopped wanting to open cans or clean bowls. The act of eating beans alone in a quiet kitchen, sweet, thick, and lukewarm, felt less like dinner and more like evidence of how far life had shrunk. The meal that once fed families at picnics and church suppers became a private, silent act of survival. The can sat in the cupboard until it bulged and rusted, and when someone finally cleaned out the kitchen after a fall or a funeral, they threw it away without opening it. The beans no one wanted to eat became the meal no one wanted to remember. These 30 meals weren't just food. They were the last defense against hunger when no one else was coming to cook, to care, or to stay. These last 5 meals stripped food down to its most basic function: fuel, fast, and cheap. No pretense, no presentation, no apology, just seniors living alone, eating what they could manage. When hunger mattered more than taste and silence was louder than any meal ever was. These 30 meals weren't recipes, they were mathematics. They were the calculations seniors made when grocery budgets shrank, when cooking for one felt pointless, when arthritis made chopping dangerous, and standing at the stove exhausting. They were meals stripped down to their most basic function: fuel, fast, cheap, and quiet. No one photographed them. No one wrote them down. No one celebrated them. They were eaten alone, in silent kitchens, with no one watching and no one coming. These meals disappeared not because they stopped working, but because they became evidence. Evidence of poverty, evidence of isolation, evidence of aging, Evidence that life had shrunk to the size of a single plate, a single bowl, a single can, opened with shaking hands. Younger generations called them old people food and wrinkled their noses. Grocery stores stopped stocking them. Kitchens were cleaned out after falls, after hospitalizations, after funerals, and the cans, the boxes, the jars, all of it, was thrown away without a second look. But these meals kept people alive. They kept bodies moving when appetite disappeared. They kept routines intact when everything else was falling apart. They were dignity measured in 10-minute intervals, comfort found in repetition, and survival disguised as dinner. The seniors who made them didn't complain. They didn't ask for help. They just opened the can, heated the soup, buttered the toast, and kept going. Today, most people have no idea what their grandparents ate when no one was watching. They don't know how hunger works when you live alone, how cooking changes when no one else is coming, how food becomes something you tolerate instead of enjoy. These 30 meals are a record of that, a quiet, unsentimental record of what it looked like to survive when survival was all that mattered. Drop a comment. What state are you watching from? Which meal shocked you the most? And if this history matters to you, subscribe, because this is the kind of knowledge that disappears when the last person who lived it is gone.